the role of the threshold in a very simple daily experience. Before entering the house, the Japanese stand on the lintel in order to remove the shoes worn outside in the street. Upon entering the house, they put on slippers placed inside the door. This forces a very deliberate and conscious way of standing still, even if for a moment, in order to show respect for the difference between two spaces, the outer and the inner. The preparation for the encounter with another person or another household. This pause for reflection and preparation deliberately opens our hearts to the unknown before us and gives us the space to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. I love this idea of removing our shoes when we enter a new space. And I'd like to think that this is something we can do as we are being hospitable to liminal space in our lives, is to remove our shoes. Anybody heard that idea before of removing our shoes? I thought of Moses when he was called by God at the burning bush. And he was told to remove his shoes because this was holy ground. What if we started seeing liminal space as holy ground, these in-between waiting times, as holy space where God can meet us? And we can use that idea of removing our shoes as a way to give honor to whatever God is wanting to do. That idea of being hospitable is not just to experiences, but to God himself, saying, God, I welcome you in. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay in this with you until you move me on. He visits his people on the threshold of change and movement towards a preferred future. And the only proper response is that of hospitality and humbly receiving God's presence. This happens to Moses. This happens to Abraham. It happens to so many giants of our faith throughout the scriptures where they are visited by God and their response is hospitality to him. Hospitality can also be an expression of love for ourselves. We need to be hospitable to what's changing and happening in us, to really embrace the movement that our own souls are going through, the difficulties, the hardships, the emotions. I know that there was a lot of time where I was just in this really darkness, and then I felt guilty for being in a bad place. I felt like, what's wrong with me? I shouldn't be feeling this way. I was not being hospitable to my own journey through a dark place. I needed to just allow myself to be there, and then in that, I could receive whatever I needed to hear from it. Instead, part of the non-hospitality was that I guilted myself for being there, which made me feel worse. I want you to look at the questions on your page where it says Liminal Questions. And just think for a moment what you might be able to, how you might be able to answer some of those for yourself. I've given a paragraph that sort of sums up this idea of hospitality. These questions are for you to take and walk through on your own, in your own time. And I hope you'll take a journal and maybe ask yourself some of these at another time. But what does it mean to you to welcome an in-between waiting space, to allow liminality to be at home with you? And if you had to give yourself a rating on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think you're doing? And then what do you think that you could do to move towards that? Maybe you need to have a practice of every morning as you put on your shoes, saying a prayer that says, today I am welcoming, I am putting on my welcoming shoes. I'm going to walk this journey with God. Or maybe every day when you take your shoes off, you say, this is holy ground, this place today, whatever happened, even if it was nothing, it's holy ground. I'm removing my shoes. Every time you remove your shoes, that can be just that symbol that helps you move towards an attitude of hospitality. And maybe every time you walk through a doorway, you let that be a reminder that God has something for you in this space. Okay, the second posture is that of mourning. Every time we move into liminal space, we are letting go of something. Every time we go through a major change, we are mourning the loss of something. And just like in-between times are not really very accepted in American culture, mourning is also not honored very well, I think, in our culture. I mean, if you think about it, We might get a couple of days of bereavement from work. We might get a week at the most. The funerals of someone that we lose, it's done within a couple of days. We're not given a year of mourning. We're not given years of mourning. We're expected to move on from this. This is a part of liminal space that I wish that we could regain and think through and process what we're losing and give it space to work its way through us. It's not a step-by-step journey, like I said before. There's not just a simple pathway through it. Really, what I'd like you to do is take what you know about the process of mourning and apply it to these in-between times that you're facing. So you face a transition, and maybe it's a good thing. Maybe you've quit a job that you didn't want, and you're moving towards a new job. And you've got this in-between time, and you should be all excited. It's still a good idea to think back through what losses am I facing? What's changing? What am I having to let go of? And allow yourself to mourn the loss of that. Losses they're hard to imagine what they might be until we're given a chance to really think them through. And maybe we have to process this with someone else. Maybe, like one of the questions under mourning is, what are the biggest losses you're facing? Then the next question after that, what losses are more subtle? And you may be able to answer the first one, but you may not be able to answer the next one until you process it through. What have you left behind? We often try and run again from mourning, just like we try and run from waiting. This is one of those things that if we can put ourselves in a posture of allowing loss to be a part of what we're processing through during liminal times, we won't run from it. We will embrace it as just a part of the journey. God walks with us through those times, and boy, there's a lot to be gained from learning how to be comforted by God himself. And we often think, we especially minimize the losses that are not just the loss of a human being, but the losses of identity, the losses of stability, the losses of a life that we knew. We don't mourn those very well. So we also don't know how to receive comfort during those times. And that's often what sends us into a deep frustration. You know, there's oftentimes a loss of expectations, a loss of what we thought our life would be. Maybe those are some of the losses that we need to process in this time. When I was first married, like I said, I had lost so much of my identity that had gone before. But I didn't know how to process those losses. And so I thought I should just figure out what was next. And I didn't take the time to say, wow, I used to be an athlete, and that's not built into my life anymore. It's a loss for me. And it was funny because about every fall, which is when my basketball team would start our season, and then we would usually go travel to out of state, a bunch of tournaments or so on. It seemed like when we were first married, every fall, I just got the itch to go somewhere. I had to be on a road trip somewhere, and I didn't understand it. But I hadn't processed that this is part of that rhythm of my life that was cut off when I left school. The same thing, I think fall connected to school is the same as well. You've been in school all your life, and suddenly you're out of school. Summer still feels like the in-between time, right? And then the fall, something should happen. And it takes a while to get to the point where the rhythms of the year go from January to December, because kids don't do that, and our whole lives are built around that. Those are some of those subtle losses that we need to recognize. Loss of routine, loss of rhythm, loss of things that are stable for us. A couple of things that I want to say about loss, and we'll move on. There's a bit of a process that happens as we go through loss, and one of them, at least for me, was a learning to be dependent. In the middle of my facing loss, I didn't know how to depend on anything but myself. But as I was mourning, I needed the presence of God. I needed people around me to step in. This dependence, though, required that I trust. And I wasn't sure I knew who I was trusting. That trust was built on things that weren't necessarily right to be trusting, if that makes any sense. I was depending on God, who I trusted to come through for me. I was trusting that he was going to make my life turn out the way that I wanted. Well, that was not something he ever promised. So my trust was built on something inappropriate. Therefore, when it didn't happen, I thought I couldn't trust God. Therefore, when I couldn't trust him, then I didn't depend on him. When it wasn't based at all in the right foundation of trust, it was based in a false idea of what I was trusting. This time period for us through Liminal Space, where we're having to depend on God and learn to trust him, we also at the same time have to allow our understanding of God to be run through. Who is this God we're trusting, and what does he really promise? Does he promise that I'm always going to have what I want? Does he promise he's going to fulfill all my dreams? Does he promise that I'm going to be able to accumulate the externals that I always thought I would have? Does he promise that no one around me is ever going to die? No, he does not. And so when those things happen, if I've built my trust on all good things happening in my life, then when they don't, and I let that affect my trust, I need to go back through and say, who is this God I'm trusting? This idea of new assumptions, once we can get to that point where we open up our hearts to these new assumptions of God that are based in the scriptures and based in a life that's got a depth of understanding of God himself, then we have hope and we can depend on a God who is real and not an idea. A God who shows up and shows himself, and we depend on then and trust those things that he has proven himself in. And so these assumptions, part of reevaluating these assumptions, we're going to talk a little bit more in the posture of revision, because that's an important part of being able to get through, let me not use that language. I don't want to talk about getting through this. A part of embracing and receiving the benefits of liminal space is allowing our idea of God to be restructured. These questions are hard, these questions that come up about God. And there is a strength that comes from learning how to live in the tension of unanswered questions. We don't always get the answers we want. We don't always get the understanding of God that we want. He doesn't always just make it easy. But it's in the depending on him, the moving towards him in a posture that says, I will receive whatever version of you, God, is real. In that dependence, then, we can live with unanswered questions because we have the kind of relationship that sustains mystery. And that word is really hard for some people to allow in their lives. I mean, a lot of us love reading a mystery novel or watching a movie mystery, but that's because we have a nice little conclusion at the end. And if it doesn't come to a conclusion at the end, then we want the sequel. We can't wait till it comes out, right? If there's no conclusion. And wow, when can we learn to just enjoy knowing that God is so big that not all the questions are going to be answered and receive a sense of mystery? There's an author who I would love for you all to read at some point. His name is Jerry Sitzer, and he writes a book called A Grace Disguised. And in this book, he tells his story of catastrophic loss. All at once, in a tragic car accident, he lost his mother, his wife, and one of his children. And he processes through the loss that he faces, and it's a very insightful, profound book. I want to read to you a portion of what he says near the end of the book when he's given us some insight into all of the things that he's gained through this journey, the grace disguised in it. He says, I still have a sorrowful soul, yet I wake up every morning joyful, eager for what the new day will bring. Never have I felt as much pain as I have in the last 3 years, yet never have I experienced as much pleasure in simply being alive and living an ordinary life. Never have I felt so broken, yet never have I been so whole. Never have I been so aware of my weakness and vulnerability, yet never have I been so content and felt so strong. Never has my soul been more dead, and yet never has my soul been more alive. What I once considered mutually exclusive, sorrow and joy, pain and pleasure, death and life, have become parts of a greater whole. My soul has been stretched. Above all, I have become more aware of the power of God's grace and my need for it. So look through the questions on mourning. What does it mean to you to be in mourning? You need to answer that. Your answer to what it means to be in mourning will say a lot about what you are going to allow yourself to do over this time period of being in liminal space. What are the biggest losses you're facing? And then ask that deeper question, what are the subtle losses that maybe aren't quite so apparent? And how do you typically handle pain, loss, insecurity? And how is that working for you? And if you say, yeah, it doesn't work very well, I don't do too well with handling pain and loss and insecurity, then what needs to change? So let's move on to the next posture. It's called making the journey, taking a posture of a pilgrim. On a sacred journey, has anybody here taken a pilgrimage before? A sacred pilgrimage? No. We don't have a lot of holy spaces in America, but it would be really good to look. There are some holy places that are worth traveling to. But I would say maybe we need to broaden our definition of pilgrimage, because I feel like probably everybody has taken this kind of journey to a special place. A vacation might be a pilgrimage. That pilgrimage is that on the journey you are enjoying yourself, you are getting somewhere, you're moving towards something, but it's not just the end goal of getting there that matters. It's the whole experience of it that's part of it. It's that idea of the journey versus the destination. We know where we're headed, but we're open to anything that comes along the way. That's the posture of a pilgrim. The passage matters. In the posture of a pilgrim, we know that we're waiting, but we're not just sitting on a bench somewhere. Although sitting on benches is a really great thing to do because you meet the most amazing people if you're open to it. But this posture of journey is that we know we're not just sitting there. It's an active waiting. We're moving. But we're also open to the side roads and the detours. We're open to the delays that we find, the people that we meet along the way that may need our help, the people that we meet along the way that may be helping us. This posture of journeying is a beautiful picture of traveling through liminal space and what it can do for us. We tend to, as a journeyer, know that there's going to be difficult times, and this posture helps us to weather some of those times. We may move through an entire section of our journey without actually getting anywhere. Has anybody been following Emily Fisher on her journey on the Appalachian Trail? Some of you have. I love what I read from her and the value that she sees even in the 0 days. 0 days are days where you make no progress up the trail. 0 days are welcomed when you know that it's the journey that matters and not just the goal. You think that she doesn't care about getting to the goal, you're wrong. But she welcomes 0 days, days where they have to take detours, or she goes with some friends on an adventure that she hadn't planned for. It's part of the atmosphere of traveling on a long-distance trail. Appalachian Trail is 2,100 miles, and it takes months to get through. And they have a plan. And they have expectations of markers that they're going to meet at a certain time, but they're also open to 0 days. From the time we enter school, actually from the time we're born, really, because our parents see it early on, there's this expectation that progress is going to happen, that we're going to become something next. What's the next thing? What's the next grade? What's the next movement? What are you doing after that? And this idea of a journeyer, a pilgrim, slows us down a little and says, you don't always have to be moving somewhere towards a particular destination. A pilgrim is someone who is a sojourner. They may be a stranger in a land for a while. Like, take on this idea of a pilgrim, that you're a pilgrim on this path. It both as potentially as a physical act as well as a metaphor. Some of you need to take pilgrimages in the middle of your liminal space and go somewhere on a journey that gives you a physical expression of what your heart is processing through. Take a journey somewhere and take your journal and take questions that are going to help you process what's happening, or take somebody with you that will talk you through what you're facing. And let that pilgrimage be a physical reminder of what it means to be on this journey through liminal space. There's another book I like to recommend. If anybody know me, I'm always recommending books, so you shouldn't be surprised that every few minutes I'm recommending another book. This is called The Sacred Journey by Charles Foster, and he writes this: "One of the constant refrains in pilgrim tales is that you find food when you need it, that you meet at the crossroads the person who knows the way, that when you fall, the backpack of the next stranger has in it a dressing that exactly covers your wound. These observations are usually made with surprise and wonder. What is certainly true is that when we prize ourselves away, be it ever so slightly, from the mind-boggling complex raft of support mechanisms we wrongly call our lives, and that we think we need, we are immediately shocked and delighted at the apparent beneficence of the world. It seems to have been set up for us. By the end of the second day on the road, the wonder has started to breed trust." I love that picture of a sacred journey, that the things come along just when you need them. Maybe not when you thought you needed them, but exactly when you needed them. And upon taking any real physical journey, you do have to have some preparation. You do plan what's coming as much as you can. And then, as you're taking the journey, you're prepared for whatever happens, because you can't control what happens, but you have a few tools along with you. You have some equipment. So one of a really good thing to do during working on this posture of being a pilgrim is to consider your resources. Take an inventory of your life, of what you have, and maybe see what's missing. An important thing to look at is, like, where do you draw your strength from? What is your nourishment like? We have to think about what food you're bringing with you when you go on a journey. You have to think about where you're going to stay. You have to think about who's going with you. These are all really good questions to even ask on a metaphorical journey that you're taking. What are my resources, and where are they lacking, and where do I need to draw in more strength and resources for this journey so that I can sustain myself through this time period? So look at those questions there for being a pilgrim. Take an inventory of your resources, what's available to you, who's traveling with you, what equipment do you need? And then I would encourage you to ask yourself if you need to take an actual physical pilgrimage to give yourself some space to process the in-between times. Do you have a place where you can ask the hard questions? If you can't take a real pilgrimage, then I would say give yourself something to remind yourself that you're on a pilgrimage in general. What can you do each day to get up? And maybe it's a reminder on the wall. Maybe it's whenever you put on your shoes, you think, and today's the day I'm walking through whatever's coming this day. On whatever part of my journey, wherever it takes me, I'm going to walk this path. Yes, taking the posture of a pilgrim opens us up to the possibility of discovering untapped creative resources that will propel us when the journey feels discouraging and long, as long as we keep our eyes up and keep looking around the trail. All right, let's talk about taking a posture of revision. Now, one of the things that I noticed when I looked at this anthropological study of separation, margin, and reentry is that when those kids were out in the wilderness, what they knew of their culture was completely unstructured. So they didn't have authority over them anymore. They didn't have expectations of what they were to do. They experienced a period of unstructure. Now, unstructure is very unstable, isn't it? We like structure for the most part. But here's the value of going through a posture of revision, where we're allowing what we know to be opened up, taken apart, looked at, and revised if we need it to be. That from the margins, from the outside of it, we can see what it is. When you're in the middle of it, you often can't see what it is. You can't pay attention to the details when you're living them all the time. And so the value of taking a posture of revision during this time is that maybe it's a chance for you to revisit some of the things that you always thought you knew that maybe you don't know so well anymore. It happens when college students leave home and they go off to school, and suddenly they have a chance to look back at their families and say, wow, that was really unhealthy. Have you seen that probably as parents or as college students? You remember looking back and saying, oh, I never noticed how crazy my family was until I got out of living there all the time and see other people's families and think, oh, that's not normal.